well, we're going to get started. I want to thank all those that are watching at home or who are here live in the audience with us. My name's Robert Hayes. I'm the Community Outreach Librarian and Head of Technical Services at the Tewksbury Public Library. This is our fourth in-person author visit in about 2.5 years. Okay, so we're finally getting back into the swing of things. I appreciate Tewksbury Telemedia being here. They're streaming this event live on their YouTube channel, and they're also streaming, televising live on their local access TV channels. So we appreciate them being here and making this a hybrid event. So I want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library and the Corning Foundation with Corning Life Sciences here in Tewksbury for co-sponsoring tonight's event. And we'll get right into it here. For those who are watching at home, I believe the YouTube comments are disabled. So if you do have a question for Alexandra, you're going to want to email me. I emailed you all my email address earlier today. But again, it's rhayes, R-H-A-Y-E-S, at tewksburypl.org. So feel free to email me if you're watching live and have a question or a comment. Okay, so tonight, author Alexandra Marshall will discuss her recent memoir, The Silence of Your Name, The Afterlife of a Suicide. The Silence of Your Name revolves around the suicide of Alexandra's charismatic and idealistic young husband, Tim Buxton, while they were in Ghana with Operation Crossroads Africa, which was like an ancestor of the Peace Corps. Alexandra weaves in her husband's hidden family history, one tied to Boston's wealthy social scene and the deaths of notorious Black Sun publisher Harry Crosby and Tim's aunt Josephine Roch Bigelow. By allowing readers to experience these distinct periods of time in great detail, Alexandra illuminates the toxic effects of denial across classes and generations. As Alexandra moves on with her life, she's now a novelist and young widow, she must navigate her way in the publishing world with the guidance of her friend Philip Roth, while still processing the grief of losing her husband. Decades later now, Alexandra finds herself in the footprints of her past, journeying back to Ghana and reuniting with a royal queen mother and the steadfast community that offered her its support decades earlier. So Alexandra Marshall's essays and short fiction have appeared in AGNI, 5 Points, Hunger Mountain, Literary Hub, The American Prospect, The American Scholar, The Boston Globe, The New York Times, and in several anthologies. She has published 5 novels, including Gus and Bronze, Tender Offer, The Brass Bed, Something Borrowed, and The Court of Common Pleas, and also a book of nonfiction entitled Still Waters. With the publication of this work, earlier versions of The Silence of Your Name, The Afterlife of a Suicide, have last achieved a beginning, a middle, and an end. So all those here in person and all those watching at home, let's give a big round of applause to Alexandra for joining us here tonight. And Alexandra, the floor is yours. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert. In addition to readers, librarians are a writer's most cherished friends because even more than booksellers and publishers, librarians keep books in print and in circulation. So thank you, Robert, very, very much for your work as a librarian and for that kind introduction. And thanks to you in the room and to you on Zoom. When a writer friend of mine recently published a memoir, his next-door neighbor said to him, "I read your book. I found a lot of things in it that I was surprised you would want your neighbors to know about you." Well, you're not my next-door neighbors, but in fact, I wrote this book precisely to tell you these things about me. I'm a novelist. And if I could have succeeded in telling this story in a novel, I'd have left it there. I tried, believe me, I tried and I tried actually. But in these fictionalized versions, they all had the title, The Child. Trying to make suicide seem less deliberate. There are 3 key words in the title of my memoir, The Silence of Your Name, The Afterlife of a Suicide. The word suicide is a spoiler alert, of course, warning, this product contains a suicide. But the other information that I'm signaling to you here is that there is an afterlife. I will illustrate this with a reading from the book, but I must first describe the silence that also sometimes follows a suicide. In this case, the silence of your name tells you that this is a book about denial. My husband Tim died in Ghana. He and I were barely into our Crossroads Africa program when an unspecified fever initiated a rapid decline that dead-ended several days later with him cutting his own throat. Although his mother never asked to learn more than what I reported to our gathered families, when I know I mentioned the bread knife because my own mother definitely heard it, on several subsequent occasions, Helen ruefully admitted to me her reflexive need to redefine the cause of Tim's death as a tropical disease. By her consistently brave example, I gradually became alert to the function of denial as a constructive force. I felt so relieved by her lack of blame of me that I willingly honored her preference for a modified version once I understood that this was what she could live with. She didn't seem to realize that by her firm resolve not to speak of the trauma, and because I loved her, neither could I. My book begins, we were children of privilege. Tim devoted his spring break to the Voting Rights March from Selma to Montgomery, and I was soon to set off for Asia and Africa to learn the essential life lesson for a white person of being the minority race. During that summer of 1965, as we were imagining our futures together, Tim brought me to the family plot in Old Lyme, Connecticut. Among its untold stories, the inscription for a miniature marker shaped like the others reads, Catherine Lee Buxton died in infancy. I asked about the baby, Tim's sister, but Tim had only heard crib death concerning the loss of this firstborn child, and was told nothing of the grief of the young woman, his mother, married at 19 to an obstetrician nearly twice her age. To the left was the marker for Tim's grandmother, Helen Gilman Luddington Roach, a Mayflower descendant and one of Boston's civic leaders. She had been president of the Massachusetts League of Women Voters, the organization founded at the national level by her older sister, Catherine Luddington. Tim honored this history, and with his voting rights activism in the civil rights movement, he had embraced this legacy. But next to his grandmother's conventional upright marker was a pink marble slab that lay flat like a blanket. This tombstone bore the inscription in loving memory of Josephine Noyes Roach, and below it, wife of Albert Smith Bigelow. I found the cryptic inscription in Death is Victory a forlorn choice for a girl whose dates revealed that she had died at 21, my own age. But when I asked him what it could mean, he said he knew nothing about the death in 1929 of his mother's oldest sister. We moved along. And while Tim and I might have speculated about the impact of the losses of the young bride and the infant who died before their mothers, or been bridegroom, we were feeling too alive that day to brood on death's mysteries. Which of us, who on earth, could have predicted that the next stone to be placed in that plot would bear my young husband's own name, Timothy Lee Buxton, and his telescope dates? In 1976, 6 years after Tim's suicide, it was revealed in the best-selling book Black Sun by Jeffrey Wolf, as Robert mentioned, that Josephine, a bride of 6 months, had died in a murder-suicide with Harry Crosby, the older married lover who had introduced her to the black idol opium, upon which Harry daily relied for what we would call today his self-medicating the war trauma suffered during his service as an 18-year-old in World War I. When their bodies were found, the news was suppressed in the Boston papers. The New York tabloids freely speculated, but because Harry was the nephew and godson of J.P. Morgan Jr., the kindly Uncle Jack, whose generosity Harry often sought and always abused, the Times gave the story 14 cautious paragraphs under the headline, "Couple Shot Dead in Artist's Hotel," with the restrained subheads, "Suicide pact is indicated between Harry Grew Crosby and Harvard man's wife, but motive is unknown." While there was no mention of opium in the medical report, an empty quart of scotch was found with their bodies. The New York Daily Mirror revealed the alcohol content of the dead couple's brains, hers twice his, and declared Jojo Bigelow almost literally dead drunk. The medical findings also concluded that Harry had shot Josephine first and then himself, but not until several hours later. This was the secret history of the daughter the family never referred to, about whom Tim's mother said she was only 10 at the time of Josephine's death and barely knew her big sister. But what about that widower bridegroom, Albert Smith Bigelow? In the 64 years beyond that December day in 1929, when his wife lied about the purpose of her visit to New York, I learned from his prominent New York Times obituary that Bert Bigelow charted his exemplary life with a stunning modesty. He had joined the Navy the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, but became an anti-war activist in response to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. To protest the use of nuclear weapons, in 1958, Bert captained a sailing vessel he called the Golden Rule from Hawaii toward the nuclear testing site 2,000 miles away. In 1960, Bert was one of the original 13 Freedom Riders on the bus that was firebombed by Klansmen. His seatmate, a 20-year-old college student named John Lewis, later the beloved congressman from Georgia. It was just 5 years after the Freedom Riders in March of 1965 that Tim rode the Freedom Train south to Alabama for Dr. Martin Luther King's march from Selma to Montgomery. I know that if Tim could have known of Bert's courageous commitments, he would have been motivated and sustained in his own vocation. That is, if Tim had known to investigate the man whose own identity was lost to the family of the impetuous bride who gave up her life so inexplicably, he would have honored and been instructed by Bert's dedicated work for peace and justice. I can also imagine that if I'd been given the story of Josephine and Bert and come to know felt so uniquely unaccompanied. With a profound example of the rest of his life, Bert Bigelow had performed what I call the ultimate alchemy, turning violence into nonviolence. Over the years, I've written and published novels and short stories concerned with other things than suicide. Yes, as I've said, I remained oppressed by the unanswerable question of what pushes or pulls a person to suicide. And so I did finally compress all that unrequited energy into an urgent short story called Child Widow, and believed with its publication that I could finally consider that awful ambition fulfilled. But then, well, this is a spoiler alert, although it's only on page 16. But then came Tim's mother's obituary notice in the Boston Globe following her peaceful death at age 92. The 4 sisters who predeceased her are named: Josephine, Lydia, Catherine, and Phoebe. And her survivors are listed as a daughter and 2 sons, 8 grandchildren, and a great-granddaughter, with no mention of Tim. Having reimagined Tim's suicide through the distorting lens of his family's enforced denial, I was now both permitted and obliged to remember it and to write it the way it happened. I was made able to name Tim among those by whom his mother was predeceased. My new narrative recounts my husband's bleeding to death at the age of 28. It tells how 30 years later, when Tim was dead longer than he had been alive, I returned to Ghana and, unannounced, was welcomed back to the town of Wenchi, as Robert said, by the same chief and queen mother as had received us just 3 days before Tim ended his life. At last, able to reconnect with those whose own lives had been haunted ever since by the mystery of the unresolved death of their foreign guest, I was given access to the depth of my shame at not having come sooner. With the example of Bert Bigelow's long life of remarkable service to the unrelenting values that he acquired the hard way, there is a lesson. Turning violence into nonviolence is another way of saying that by embracing sorrow and in refusing the easier option of denial, a greater opportunity is created, the transformation of grief into love. This transformation of grief into love is the afterlife. It's the afterlife of a suicide when the silence that distorts and undermines it, the denial, is named. My enduring love for my young husband who took his own life is told here with this understanding, as is the durable and enduring bond with those in upcountry Ghana with whom I had shared this shocking experience. You will read about this here and learn about my journey as a writer, the vocation I claimed under the guidance of Philip Roth. His longtime partner was Tim's childhood friend, and Barbara and Philip took me in like a rescue pet. I like to say that I fed on his jokes like a continuing ed student assigned to relearn laughter. You will also learn that 7 years later, I fell in love again with the writer James Carroll, to whom I was introduced by our mutual literary agent. You'll meet our family. Among these and other passages that I could choose to read to you tonight, I've selected one about my daughter, Lizzie. It resonates for me in these recent weeks since the Supreme Court ruling, because I was in the Supreme Court in March of 1965, 57 years ago, to hear arguments in the Griswold v. Connecticut case. That legal challenge was to a Connecticut statute established in 1879, and at issue was a physician's right to prescribe contraception to married women patients. To prescribe contraception to married women patients. The co-defendant was Tim's father, Dr. C. Lee Buxton, chief of OBGYN at Yale and medical director of Planned Parenthood at its New Haven clinic. When Lizzie was in 3rd grade, she studied reproduction. Her progressive elementary school was founded with the explicit mission to create a community reflecting Boston's racial and economic diversity, a city school committed to social justice and a culture of take action. The academics were quirky, in a good way, and her insightful teacher began the academic unit with insect reproduction, introducing the kids to the dramatic flourishing that I hadn't learned to appreciate until I wrote Still Waters, my book about the Quabbin Reservoir. From there, they set up an incubator in the classroom and watched the hatching of chicks which prepared for the groundbreaking news my daughter brought home from school one afternoon, bursting through the door to announce, "Mom, Mom, Miss Cheney lays an egg every month." Around that time, Lizzie and I were crossing into the Boston Common, holding hands on an already beautiful day, when the emerging linden leaves were still chartreuse against the rain-darkened bark. It wasn't yet warm in New England, but the potential was apparent. As I'd learned from the invisible abundance of life at the Still Waters Pond, this season would have to be called something else if it weren't a coil ready to spring open. "I'm very proud of myself," she announced. What more could I hope for? But I nevertheless wanted to know what made her proud of herself. I have a very nice life. At age 9, she not only valued her life, but already knew to credit herself for it. That afternoon, I seized upon Lizzie's insight as my permanent definition of upward mobility. Copyright 1988 is typed by her teacher onto the title page of the 15 books Lizzie wrote and illustrated that year. Volumes upholstered in scraps of interesting fabric, the pages hand-sewn with yarn, her vivid drawings colored in magic marker. Each one has a dedication page. She dedicates the 2 friends to her brother. And each one displays a profound self-confidence. In How to Make Sandpaper, she asserts, "The way that you make sandpaper is quite simple. First you need an elephant and a pelican." These books held their prominent place on our shelf alongside the beloved children's classics collected by every household. And there they sat for another 20 years, until it came time to pack them up. We were giving up our address in the precious neighborhood embodying Boston's carefully preserved past for a part of the city still mostly unbuilt, representing its future. The move across town seemed more charged than your typical age-appropriate downsizing, and while my thick ambivalence was no doubt predictable, and while I was able to take satisfaction in recycling our family's accumulated belongings, I wanted the move to feel more momentum. And then it did. My now grown daughter and I faced each other on couches in the library room whose wall-to-wall bookshelves were mostly sorted into cartons. As we paused to rediscover together this collection of her own books, I sensed the opportunity for a profound revelation of my own, and I grabbed it. I said, "If I were dead, you'd be doing this alone." From Lizzie's pained expression, it seemed possible that she had so far avoided imagining ever losing me. And while I didn't want to force such a reckoning on an otherwise tender moment, I added, "All I mean is that instead of my leaving behind all these bookshelves for you to empty, we get to do it together." She nodded. I felt caught between her clear wish to let it go and my own preference not to. So I'm able to relive your childhood with through her handmade books one by one was giving us this chance not only to feel exceedingly fortunate for the life we'd shared together, but to say so. So much had remained unspoken between my mother and me that I'm always surprised to realize this isn't the case with my own daughter. It's been my life's work to reinvent that wheel, but with such a perpetual longing for forgiveness, no matter how perfectly well I know I'm not responsible for my mother's cancer, I've never felt entirely entitled to resolution. A year to the day after losing our baby Jenny, I graduated from stop-and-go psychotherapy to psychoanalysis, where I endlessly traveled the short distance back and forth between the known and the unknown. It was exactly then, when Lizzie was writing these 15 books that offer a better definition of mental health than all my own spiral notebooks. On the wall opposite our paired couches hung 50 framed family photos, rendering 50,000 words redundant. Still, I remembered her upward mobility declaration from when she was a girl, and I repeated it back to her. I have a very nice life. Despite the disabling losses I'd struggled against, here was my own revelation. I'm not dead. I allowed myself to say this out loud, too, to not only claim my existence, but to define it by this moment. Perhaps it was even my impulse to credit myself for being alive, the way, at the elegant age of 9, on our walk in the common, holding hands, Lizzie had claimed the creation of her very nice life. She seemed to be waiting for more from me. So, quoting her again, I added the sentence I had never expected to hear myself say, I'm very proud of myself. So that's the story of the afterlife, or one part of the afterlife. I know Robert invited questions, either from the room or on Zoom, if there are any coming into your email address. We can take some questions, and then I can finish with a very short passage, because I want to introduce this Queen Mother that I have mentioned in Ghana. So I will end there.
Great. And I do believe there may be a 30 or 60-second delay, so I may not get questions immediately via email, but I'll be keeping an eye out. But I'll ask the first question, if that's okay. Curious as to why you think suicide is such a taboo topic in society today. I know that I was looking up stats while you were speaking, and it's the second leading cause of death for Americans between the ages of 10 and 35. And I think I'm oversimplifying it, but the statistics were middle school and high school students take some sort of annual health survey every year that's reported to the state and federal government, and it's something like 15% of high school students seriously consider suicide, 10% make a plan, and 5% actually make an attempt. So given all these startling statistics and how I think it's something like 130 Americans commit suicide every day, why isn't it talked about more? And do you hope that is one of the things that your book accomplishes?
I'll start there. Yes, I certainly do hope it's one of the things my book accomplishes, because I think one of the reasons it is taboo is that it is not knowable, really. I mean, we all would like to know a person's dying thoughts, but we cannot, by definition, know the dying thought of a suicide. And I think that's very upsetting. And I think that because it is so little understood, certain beliefs evolve. I'll give an example from my own life. This was himself suicidal. He died a natural death, but he had made several suicide attempts. And my assumption was that if you have a parent who had been put in several asylums, on his own, because he knew that he was a danger to himself. And my feeling about that was, for Tim's sake, that therefore, by definition, he would never commit suicide, because he knew how awful it would have been if his father had succeeded. Well, that was so naive on my part, I mean, it's understandable, yes, but it's regrettable. And I think that, there are just so many stories like that people have, assumptions that are made that have no basis in the. I think that, there's the poet John Berryman who killed himself by jumping off a bridge, and he has a very famous poem where he says, everyone halfway down from the bridge changes his mind, except he wrote that poem and then he jumped, nevertheless. Teen suicides, what could possibly be more upsetting than that? And I wish that, that people, I mean, Tim was 28, not a teenager, but, when you think about, I'm 78 now, I mean, I have lived 52 years longer than Tim, and when I think of all the world that I know, all the love that I have enjoyed, the love that he would have enjoyed, it becomes really beyond mysterious, beyond mysterious.
Sharon, or did anyone in the room have a comment or a question for Alexandra?
I'm going to take down my mask to say something. I was thinking about when you were reading the obituary and finding the omission of of Tim from the family history. And I was thinking about the obituary of a friend of mine that I read recently where his son was omitted. It was the same thing, the omission of the suicide. And there's something about the deep sense of failure, maybe, that that doesn't get owned to in the obit. I can't sort it, but it was shocking because I knew it, and I knew it was a signal event in his life, and was shocked that it was omitted. And I have to believe that it was the same for Tim's mother. And so what that mechanism is by which that is hidden as the dark history of a family or something is very sad, because it seems to be a trauma that we're letting to continue by not embracing it and saying, yes, this touched me as well. Do you think?
Yeah. A recent, the ethicist column in the Times by Kwame Anthony Appiah, philosopher, one of the questions that was asked was, there was a couple whose son or daughter had taken his or her own life, and the wife insisted on not telling people that was the cause of the death, and the husband, as is often the case, I think, not wanting to make things more painful for the spouse, went along with it. And then, according to this letter written to ask, what do I do now, had come to terms more, and really felt like he wanted to be able to claim suicide as the cause of that death. And so the question is, what do I do?
Exactly.
I mean, the opposite, we all had an experience of Jamie Raskin, and the opposite experience of his claiming his son's death right there. His book is wonderful. If The Unreckoning, I think it's called, is such a wonderful book. I really recommend to all of you that you come over to the Tewksbury Library and take it out, or go buy it. But that really is so helpful to other people, because you can see, I mean, what I called the ultimate alchemy before I had known about the death of his son Tommy. It is really, you turn grief into love. And I do feel so sad, really, for Tim's family. I have no reason to believe that the omission was deliberate. I think it's just that they just didn't talk about him.
Yeah, I know, the erasure of it.
And the thing is, I was connected to them all, and
Did you stay connected to them?
No.
Through your life, did you stay connected to the family?
Yeah.
So you kind of lived a bit of that future that you had imagined
Absolutely.
with him. Yeah. But then you had your other future.
Yeah, and as I say, you know, denial is a constructive force in my case, because you know, I was encouraged by Tim's mother to get a life, you know, and she encouraged me in my writing. I changed my name back to my family name, and she the way she understood it was that I needed a nom de plume, and so she could understand that, and you know, she was extremely encouraging. Close to our children, there was much that, you know, we kept alive, even though we didn't talk about Tim.
Right.
Once his ashes were buried in the ground, that was it. And so the constructive force of it gnawed at me, as I admit, you know, with all these failed attempts to write it as a novel, you know, and not really understanding that it was that denial that was holding me back. And you know, what happens often, I think, with nonfiction, and why nonfiction is, in some ways, can offer things that fiction cannot, is that if something happened and it's kind of unbelievable, it's powerful.
Yeah.
And that's when I realized that it's kind of unbelievable to have read that obituary notice, but that was the gift to Tim.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that you are a writer and that you solve your problems through writing and you discover solutions through that. And I was thinking about that as the perfect use of the memoir, you know, that the memoir doesn't just recount, it reassesses, it reaffirms, it recommits, and it reconstructs, you know. And I feel like that's like the major accomplishment in reading this, and I'm monopolizing.
Well, but let me just say, I'm so glad that you're here, Sharon. Sharon Shailu, I have the privilege of serving on the board of the Massachusetts Center for the Book, of which Sharon is director. It's one of the 50 affiliates that is under the umbrella of the Library of Congress, and it's a real, we've had some very good times, but we don't always, you know, get to be in the room together alone, so to speak. So thanks for coming.
I was delighted I got here. I was racing on 495.
Yeah. Thank you, Sharon, for being here. Thanks for the question. Jamie Raskin's book is Unthinkable, is the name of the book, yeah.
Okay,
and
thank you.
So I guess a question for you, Alexandra, from one of the viewers at home. I've gotten one question so far. So, you know, you've written, I think it was 5 novels, you've written now 2 pieces of nonfiction, and you've been widely published all over the place. Any general advice for aspiring writers?
Yes, I will tell you what I was taught by Philip Roth. And as I said, I was taken in literally into their home and spent a lot of that first year. And Philip taught me, I say he taught me to write, but he really taught me to read. And the way he lived his life as a writer was to write and then to spend twice that much time every day reading. And I really came to do that myself. I was a French major, so I had not read American literature. I had never read any of the 4 books that he had published by the time of Portnoy's Complaint, which actually, I should say in this moment that's when this was, you know, when this explosive publication of Portnoy's Complaint was going on. Philip was nevertheless this like guidance counselor, I would say. And it wasn't that he was encouraging me to write, not at all, but he was encouraging me to be his student. And then when I did write, and I showed him something, he gave me that title, The Child Widow, like a gold star. And that's why I wouldn't give it up, that title, and why I finally had to publish something with that title. So advice to a young writer is, first of all, turn your attention to it first. So obviously, most people either go to school or have a job, and get yourself up an hour early. If you write something 5 days in a row, by the end of those 5 days, you have something, however much it is, 5 paragraphs, 5 pages. You can bribe yourself. I did this one time. There was a ring I really liked. It was in a small ad in the New Yorker, and I cut it out and put it on the bulletin board above my desk, and I said, when you get to page 100, you can send away for that ring. So I did. And I mean that seriously, too. I mean, you have to kind of just don't keep going back and going back, because the thing that you don't know until you've done it for the first time is you have to get to the end for the first time in order to know what your book is about, what your short story is about, what your essay is about. Obviously, you're starting with an idea, and you have to find a way to realize it, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. But the thing is that you just need to get to the end for the first time. And then you can go back and say, oh, I see. I didn't know that about her or him at that point. This is given way too much weight. It's insignificant. I needed to know that as a, I needed to know that as a writer, but the reader doesn't need to know that. And these are the sorts of things you don't know as you're trying to make yourself get to the end for the first time. So I guess that's the most important thing that I would say to a young writer.
So Alexandra, at this point, why don't you read the passage that you were going to read,
Okay.
And then we can start to wrap it up.
Okay.
Great.
As Robert said, I went back to Ghana. It took me 30 years, as I say, it took me 30 years to the day to revisit the scene of the crime, and it was partly because Tim had been dead longer than he was alive, and that just seemed wrong. And it wasn't that I hadn't observed each anniversary. I did, the 5th, the 10th, the 15th, and so on. And then my own life kind of got in the way, I guess. And so it did take me that long. And when I arrived in Ghana, I didn't know how to let anybody know that I was coming. But I had the most extraordinary piece of traveler's luck. On my plane, to get to Ghana in those days, you would fly from New York or Boston to London, and then you'd have to basically spend a day there, and then you'd go down to Ghana overnight. So it was like an arduous thing. And a member of my book club group in Boston is Nigerian and had deep connections in Ghana. And I told her that I was going to be going back, but she wasn't sure of whether she would be there or what her plans would be. So I said, okay, fine. Well, I have to go. I have to be there on July 10th. And so I'm just going to go. Anyway, she was on my plane, which I didn't know because she was in first class. I didn't know till we landed. And so she introduced me to her godfather, who kind of swept me into a velvet-curtained anteroom, and my passport control was taken care of, my luggage was taken care of, and so on. And we got to talking, and he said, "Is this your first trip to Ghana?" And I said, "Well, no, actually." And gave him a very short sentence about what brought me back and what had happened when I was there before. The next night, he brought me to a nightclub where this woman showed up, a very fashionable, she turned out to be a fashion designer, young woman who was a niece of the chief and queen mother from this upcountry village. A very distinguished family I did not know. That's another source of shame, because one of the reasons why this why this death was so scandalous was it was the ancestral village of the prime minister. Their brother, the chief and the queen mother's brother, was the prime minister of Ghana. He was overthrown in a coup, not too much later, alas. But anyway, this was what I was coming back into. And so the young fashion designer was the niece, and she said, actually, my aunt is in Accra right now. And I said, do you think she might be willing to have dinner with me tomorrow night? And Accra is the capital. And she said, yes. So this is that night. I overdressed, and my long black sheath proved to be a fortunate choice when the Queen Mother crossed my hotel's lobby the next night in a floor-length ivory satin strapless dress with a matching stole over one shoulder. She wore a 4-strand pearl necklace and matching bracelet, but her vibrant face seemed unchanged from the only other time we'd met, when on that day in 1970 she had impressed me indelibly, being at once traditional and cosmopolitan by wearing the crisp uniform of a nurse midwife. Nana Frema and her niece and I were seated at a small round table in the hotel's formal dining room. There were too many waiters with not enough to do, but the setting proved conducive and was made cozy by the candlelight that prompted the Queen Mother to ask why they would waste candles when the electricity hadn't gone out. In Wenchi, the power had been rationed by the use of a town generator that was cut off at night, and I would never forget holding the flashlight when the nurse came to administer the supposed narcotic cure for Tim's radical sleep deprivation. Because all these years had elapsed, I realized that I had no concrete idea, none at all, of what I would find there. When Nana Frema inquired about my intentions for this return, I told her that I wished to revisit Wenchi to pay my respects to her brother, the chief, to express to him my regret and profound gratitude. If I was improvising, I was also, in fact, summoning up my truest feelings. She asked to hear more. So I began by describing who my young husband had been, the scholar-athlete ideal and gifted teacher who so quickly and unaccountably became completely debilitated and demoralized. I talked about the fever and the provisional diagnosis of malaria that was then compounded by dysentery and sunstroke. I mentioned the Gulf's undertow on that first afternoon and the greater undermining fear of failure. I told her his saying he'd never again play tennis ought to have meant more to me than it did. I wanted her to have some sense of Tim other than the terrible way his life had ended. She listened to all this with the attentive compassion of a nurse. And then she asked, "But don't you think it was a bit selfish of him?" Shall we leave it there?
Well, Alexandra, I do have an audience comment from home. Szifra, S-Z-I-F-R-A, Szifra Burke, B-I-R-K-E. I hope I'm pronouncing this right. She says, I just want to say how much I appreciated Alexandra's sincerity and her presence. This topic is of particular importance to me. I, too, am the wife of a husband who committed suicide back in 1997. And Szifra also has a book to be published with her current husband about building their relationship after this loss. She was almost 50 when he and I met, and the name of her upcoming book is called In Tandem, Pedaling Through Midlife on a Bicycle Built for Two. And it sounds like she'd like to get in touch with you. So that was from Szifra Burke. So
Okay.
thought I'd pass that along.
Well, you have my email address, so you can pass that along. Congratulations. In Tandem is a wonderful title.
Yeah, I think so. For those in the room and those many more that are watching at home, let's give a big round of applause to Alexandra for a wonderful presentation this evening. And for those who registered, look for an email for me tomorrow with a link to this recording, a link to a feedback survey, and some information about some other in-person, hybrid, and virtual author visits happening this summer. So again, want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library, the Corning Foundation, and Tewksbury Telemedia, and most importantly, Alexandra, for being here tonight. Thank you all and have a great night.